Well, gentlemen, I think a lot of people think of the Reformation as a theological endeavor. How did it lead to evangelism? How did it affect evangelism? Danny?
Well, I often say to my students at the school where I teach at Southeastern, you can't be a good theologian without being a good missionary and evangelist. And you can't be a good missionary and evangelist without being a good theologian. They are naturally wedded to each other. And when you look back at the Reformation, you discover that the natural outgrowth of recapturing the gospel and the great solas of the faith had to inevitably lead to evangelism and missions. And you see that launched out of that, and then eventually it reaches kind of a hotbed with Brainerd, and then later with Carey, and all of that you can trace back historically to the roots of the Reformation.
Yeah, in a recovery of the gospel is by nature in effort towards evangelizing, right? There's no gospelizing apart from discovery or rediscovery of the gospel.
Yeah, that's right. Danny, a lot of folks have the idea that Calvin and others didn't really have a view of missions. You're the historian among us. Tell us how to respond to that.
Just go read Calvin's commentaries. Okay. And you'll discover that he naturally saw the recovery of the gospel as leading to world missions and world evangelization. And Calvin himself sent out missionaries to places where he knew the gospel needed to spread and needed to go. So it's a myth, a bad one, to say that the recovery of Reformed theology did not lead to missions and evangelism. In fact, the modern missionary movement was birthed out of the Reformation tradition. When you look at the lives again of Brainerd and Carey in America, Adoniram Judson and so on, all of these were steeped and rooted in faithful Reformed theology.
See, I love that. Wherever the gospel is recovered, you get a new momentum in relation to missions evangelism. I remember studying, I grew up in Edinburgh, and I became fascinated by this vast conference on missions, Edinburgh 1910. Yes. It was really a precursor to what became the ecumenical movement, and the biggest event that I think had taken place in the history of the church of its kind. And I discovered a sermon by James Denny a year later, and he's preaching at the annual conference of the Baptist Missionary Society, 1911. And he begins, his sermon's called Propitiation. 1 John 2:2, that Christ died not only for our sins, but for the sins of the world. And he says, you know, in the last year, there's been more talk about missions than at any other time in my life. What's come of it? Virtually nothing. What we need is people who are captivated by the gospel. Then we're going to see an advance in missions. And you're saying that's basically what happened in the Reformation.
If the gospel is recovered, there's such joy and delight in it, you cannot help but spread it and share it. If you're not wanting to share it, not wanting to spread it, then I have to question whether or not you've actually recovered the gospel.
Yeah. And Calvin was such a great model of that.
Yes.
I was recently reading his sermons on Deuteronomy, and each one of them ends with a prayer that immediately goes to the nations and God's glory spreading among the nations.
It's funny, I've been doing a series on Daniel, and I've been using as I could Calvin's massive work on Daniel. And again, at various points, you see opportunities to see the gospel emphasized as going to the nation, and he doesn't miss a beat. He drives it home very, very powerfully. This is a mandate. An obligation. In fact, he said, this is an obligation we have to take this. And of course, one of the great things about the book of Daniel, you find this every tribe, every tongue, every nation language, which is later picked up in Revelation. Well, it's right there in Daniel. And Calvin says this is a mandate that you find an obligation you find right here in these texts.
Yeah. I think it's really important for people to know that Geneva was really a mission launching city and endeavor of John Calvin's work there. I came across these numbers not too long ago, that in 1555 there were 5 Reformed or Protestant churches in France. In 1559 there were about 200.
Wow.
And then in 1562 there were 2,000. And those were all from Geneva men leaving Geneva. Maybe they had come to Geneva for training or to hear the gospel, but then they were sent back into hostile France to preach the gospel, to plant churches, It had all the marks of frontline missions.
Yeah, and the same was true, of course, with my native Scotland. John Knox goes over to study under Calvin, the greatest school of Christ on the face of the earth, he said, and came back fired up from that. And all of the Reformation in Scotland really happened as a result of the influence of Calvin on Knox.
I sure would love to see us recover a church planting movement like that in our own day. It would be something marvelous to see.
Yeah, indeed it would. All right, thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.